Imagine a man in a room. He doesn't speak a single word of Chinese, but he's been given a box of Chinese symbols along with a rulebook in English explaining exactly what to do when Chinese characters are passed to him through a slot in the wall. He receives a string, follows the instructions, and sends back a response in flawless Chinese. To someone outside, it seems obvious. The man understands the language. His responses are coherent, even fluent. But inside, he only recognizes shapes and follows mechanical steps. He has no idea what the symbols mean, let alone what the conversation is actually about. This is the famous Chinese room thought experiment proposed by philosopher John Searle, and it challenges the idea that understanding, or consciousness for that matter, can arise from mere computation. Does an intelligent system actually understand the conversation, or is it only simulating understanding? If a system behaves as though it has a mind, even seems to experience the world as we do, is that the same thing as actually having a conscious experience? Can we program consciousness? Well, here is the challenge. A system can behave as though it understands, like the person in the Chinese room argument. It might simulate conversation, emotion, even empathy, without ever experiencing anything. What it's actually doing is following rules. It plays with syntax or formal rules and patterns without semantics, the actual meaning behind those patterns. Such a system lacks something called intentionality. In philosophy of mind, intentionality refers to aboutness, or having a mental state that is about something, in a way that is meaningful to the system itself, like a belief about food, a fear of predators, a desire for warmth. The words themselves conjure images, emotions, memories. For example, when you see an apple, you don't just process color and shape, you experience it as an apple. That visual perception is tied to memory, taste, maybe even action like eating it inside a context like hunger or pleasure. There is something that it is like to perceive that apple. The apple is not just a label, it's part of a complex network of meaning in your real lived world. And it's that aboutness tied to subjective experience and context that gives rise to intentionality. One might argue that current AI systems are capable of multi-modality. They can see and recognize an apple, but they are again operating in the syntax territory. They process pixel data and match it against statistical probabilities learned from a dataset. They appear to recognize an apple, but do they really know what an apple actually is? Can they imagine the apple, smell it, desire it, fear choking on it, or associate it with autumn or candies from childhood? Not really. The system still lacks an internal semantic world and intentionality, and most philosophers argue that intentionality is an essential part of a conscious experience. But what do we even mean by consciousness to begin with? There are over 40 definitions associated with the term, and its meaning is highly debated among philosophers, scientists, and theologians alike. Think about the brain. Our understanding of the brain shifted dramatically over time. The Greeks saw the brain as a radiator, regulating body temperature by being cooler, while the blood is hot, so it must run through the brain to cool off. Then came the Romans and their latest innovations in irrigation. So the brain must be a system that controlled the flow of vital fluids called animal spirits through channels associated with sensation and movement. The Renaissance and early Enlightenment followed with their fascination with mechanical devices. Descartes likened the brain and body to a hydraulic device, and fluid pressure explained motion and reflexes. In the decades and centuries that followed, the brain was a clockwork mechanism, a telegraph system, an information processor, up to what we have now of understanding the brain as a computer or a neural web. If you look at the history of how we have understood the brain over time, what's common across all these models? You'll probably notice that they are all metaphors, reflecting the most recent technological innovations. And there is a reason for this. We as humans understand new things in terms of what we already know. I explored this in detail in another video, but basically, we did not evolve to think and philosophize. In fact, we did not even have language in the early days. We existed first and foremost in the physical world, and as such, our understanding of abstract concepts is grounded in concrete realities, things we can touch and experience. So it makes sense that our understanding of probably the most complex part of our existence, our brain and by extension consciousness, will reflect our most advanced physical object. But if we don't have anything remotely resembling consciousness outside the intangible way we experience it, how could we ever begin to understand it, let alone recreate it in a system other than ourselves? Now, one might think that quantum computers are one of the most advanced technological innovations that we are currently exploring. And indeed, quantum consciousness has been proposed. It rests on the assumption that the strange rules of quantum mechanics might play a role in how consciousness emerges in the brain. Now, I'm not a physicist, but I will try to explain it within my simple, naive understanding. If there are any physicists listening to this, I do apologize if the next bit is too painful. The basic idea of quantum mechanics is that very tiny or quantum things like atoms and electrons don't behave in the same way that objects in the macroscopic world like cars and balls do. They rather behave in weird, unintuitive ways and don't follow the rules of classical physics like Newtonian mechanics, though technically macroscopic objects follow quantum mechanics as well, but their behavior is still possible to approximate well by classical physics, which isn't possible for particles on the microscopic level. Now, some of these spooky behaviors include that particles like electrons behave like waves, so they don't sit neatly in one spot, but act like ripples or clouds until they are measured. Also, until measured, a particle does not pick a definite state. It exists in a kind of both and situation, like Schrodinger's cat that is both dead and alive until you check. This is called superposition. Just looking at a quantum system forces it to choose a specific state. Another characteristic is that two particles can be entangled, meaning that what happens to one instantly affects the other, even if they are apart. Now, because consciousness is weird and quantum physics is, well, weird, some researchers wondered whether weird could explain weird. The basic idea is that components of the brain cell scaffolding, proteins called microtubules, could support quantum events like superposition or entanglement that somehow lead to consciousness. Some theorists suggest that these quantum events inside microtubules might influence neural activity in ways that classical physics cannot explain, and that this mysterious influence could somehow give rise to consciousness. Now, this theory is highly speculative and not widely accepted, especially since the brain environment, being warm and messy, does not support sustained quantum events. So neither do we understand consciousness nor quantum mechanics fully, despite the latter being one of the most successful theories in physics ever, probably. But is understanding a problem the only way to solve it? Not necessarily. Just like evolution created consciousness, it is not unlikely that we or something smarter than us could stumble upon it, or superintelligence might crack the mystery. But here I wonder if intelligence alone can give rise to consciousness. We certainly know that intelligence is not a requisite for consciousness. Many animals are not that intelligent, yet are arguably conscious. Your cat, for instance, has preferences and can feel pain and sadness and forms bonds with you and other animals. Yet arguably it has a fluffy brain. Cute, but good for pretty much nothing. But it's also the case that no amount of intelligence can make you experience something like the redness of red, or really deeply knowing what it feels like to be eaten up by guilt or torn apart by sadness. Can you feel pain if you only understood what it means to have a sensation of pain without ever experiencing it? This raw feeling of experience called qualia is another quality of consciousness that cannot easily be described or replicated. You can describe the neurochemical processes that take place or the physical sensations, but it's nothing like actually experiencing it. Even if we do understand our own consciousness, does it mean that we understand all consciousness? In an essay titled "What is it like to be a bat?", American philosopher Thomas Nagel argued that subjective, first-person experience cannot be accessed from the outside. While he lived in a home often frequented by bats, he observed their unique way of navigating the world through sound. He argued that you can know every possible detail of that sonar and yet not know what it feels like to be a bat and to experience the world through sound. That experience is simply inaccessible to someone outside that viewpoint. Your cat recognizes you from a distance, but do you know what sort of representation you hold in its brain? So, even if we were to program consciousness into a machine, would it reflect our own consciousness as we best understand it, or would the machine develop its own unique consciousness and experience of the world? But not everyone agrees with the view that consciousness might not be programmable, or at least not in the ways we currently imagine. Some argue that consciousness is entirely a computational process and that once a system reaches sufficient complexity, consciousness will naturally arise. Strong functionalism and reductionism, among other schools of thought, would argue that there is nothing special about us or other sentient beings, that everything can be reduced to physical principles that sufficiently explain how complex systems like consciousness emerge, and that subjective experience arises from the right patterns of cause and effect, regardless of the underlying material, be it a brain or a computer. But the unifying principle is that we humans, because of our capacity to reason, will seek logical narratives to ground our experience in. We all live in our own bubbles where we have compiled a version of reality that makes perfect sense to us and is, as far as we are concerned, the truth that others struggle to see. I talk about this in more detail in this next video. If you are interested, feel free to check it out.